Welcome to this special episode of Afternoon Light, the podcast of the Robert Menzies Institute. Today I'm joined by Samuel Chamberlain, who is a Brisbane-based internal auditor but has a degree in politics, philosophy and economics from the University of Queensland. Samuel took part in our Menzies Early Career Network, which is a network bringing together Australian university students to learn about the history of the Menzies era, connect with like-minded peers and respected figures in the field of Australian political history. As part of their involvement in this program, the Menzies Early Career Network participants in 2024 contributed to a special project, writing chapters for our upcoming book, Finding Menzies, A New Generation's Inspiration for Foreign Affairs, Social Policy and Political Thought. So in this episode, I'll be talking to Samuel about his chapter, Santamaria and the DLP. Samuel, tell me, why did you choose this topic for your chapter?
Well, up in Queensland, I'm quite involved locally with a group called the Thomas More Centre. I've been with them for a couple of years, hosting interesting talks. Turns out, discovered later, that is a subsidiary of the National Civic Council, which is the legacy, I guess, of Bob Santamaria. So at the same time this program was coming into place, I was learning about that, and I thought, great, they're coinciding at the same time. This would be a good thing to write about.
Yeah, well, Bob Santamaria is an absolutely influential figure on Australian politics of the sort of mid-century, and I mean, there's lots of stories about who he was and what his influence was, and whether he prevented Labor governments from being elected through the 50s and 60s or not. But can you tell me, in your own words, who was Bob Santamaria, or B.A. Santamaria?
Well, I think he would define himself primarily as a devoted Catholic, and I think that's the best way to view his worldview. But yeah, of most interest, he is a very important political figure in, as you said, mid-20th century Australian history, primarily, or even made more so by the fact that he didn't hold a formal political office. He was an outsider, and yet his influence was great. He's an average Australian. He's a Victorian. He loved AFL. I believe he was a fan of Carlton. Big family man. But yeah, very much involved through university. His background was a lawyer, but very much involved and influenced by Campion societies, the sort of intellectual Catholicism that influenced him greatly, and ultimately opened the doors for his involvement in the National Civic Council, the Democratic Labor Party. In a lot of his writings, he reflects on how he would have just gotten the law degree and gone into practicing law, if not for some of the opportunities that arose from those Campion societies.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, he was editor of the Catholic Worker, wasn't he, a magazine? And that, of course, becomes a very influential publication. Can you tell me what Robert Menzies' feelings would have been towards B.A. Santamaria in those early years, say the 1930s?
Well, I think it's important to understand that, looking in hindsight, Santamaria's activities, involvement in the union movement, trying to influence things there, may not have been as well known up until the point of the Labor split. So Menzies would have been looking at Santamaria through his involvement with that newspaper, of which he was criticised rather heavily, right? Like, Santamaria had this idea of little townships plotting the countryside, bound together by, a church and a football club, and involved in agrarianism and so forth, so quite idealistic. And he saw Menzies, both his iteration of the Liberal Party and his earlier career at the United Australia Party, as I think the words he used was being in service of the gods of big business. So, another influence that might have coloured Menzies' thinking of Santamaria was knowing that he was, I guess the word might be, an apprentice to Daniel Mannix, who was known for flaming sectarian divides at the time. And of course, Mannix's involvement in the conscription issue, of which everyone had an opinion, was something that Menzies was highly critical of. I'm sure that would have flavoured his opinion of Santamaria as well.
And Daniel Mannix, of course, was a very famous Catholic archbishop in Melbourne during the 30s. And as you say, Santamaria was really a sort of disciple of his, for want of a better word. Menzies' relationship with the DLP, which Santamaria is sort of instrumental in creating, wasn't straightforward. I mean, they were really on the different sides of the political spectrum. Of course, the DLP being a breakaway from the Labor Party. Can you explain the differences in approach between where Menzies stood on key issues of policy and where the DLP would have stood, and why, despite those differences, they still were able to work together?
Yeah, look, I think what made them gel together was that, the DLP, I would argue, gave Menzies his long prime ministership, and at the same time, Santamaria was of the belief that he was keeping communists out of party, right? If the communists ran the trade unions, they ran the Labor Party, they'd run the government, it's game over. So he was very happy with that arrangement. But in his first edition of News Weekly, Santamaria's opinion was that communism was just as bad a thing as unbridled capitalism. His opinion in later life changed to say that, well, obviously, capitalists aren't frog marching through Europe, and they're not the same as the communist menace. So I think he was quite happy to focus on his area of the world, keeping labour rights and communists out of control in the Labor Party, even if that meant giving someone he previously expressed as despising the prime ministership at the time. I think he just had to make a decision based on the practicalities of the day as to what is the lesser of two evils. In terms of practical policy differences, it's just that typical sort of social conservative working class. So, there's a bigger role for the state. But even then, compared to the Liberal Party today, Menzies would have seen a bigger role for the state as well.
I mean, it's interesting. Menzies really opposed sectional politics. He didn't like political parties set up just for one part of society. He set the Liberal Party up to be a party of principle, not a party of farmers or trade unionists or rich business people, whatever. What he sees Santamaria doing, of course, was representing interests of anti-communist Catholics, basically. So, how did Menzies view that quite sectional and sectarian approach to politics that Santamaria pursued?
Well, he would have been opposed to it. Menzies was very clear that his way of viewing the world was that sectarianism was an opposition to the fullest form of Christianity, and he would have found it difficult to get along with someone like Santamaria, who was unapologetic about the Catholic motivations behind his group. Look, the National Civic Council today will say that it is that his was a broad movement. I personally would disagree with that. It was just the case that, if you try to get more success politically, you have to pitch a wider tent, and that's what they did. So he would have been upset by Santamaria's disposition, but at the same time, right, Santamaria, as with most Catholic hierarchy at the time, were pushing for state aid of schools, which Menzies was shown to hey, on these particular issues, I think this is reasonable. Of course, state aid isn't just for Catholic schools, but they would have been the main recipient as the largest institution providing that service. So, Menzies would have been opposed to Santamaria's disposition, but at the same time would have been willing to work on the issues, as historically that's what we've seen.
Yeah, I mean, tell me about the impact of state aid, the state aid decision of Menzies in 1963 to allow the federal government to provide funding to Catholic and non-government schools. I mean, did that do you see that having a really big impact on the welcoming in of Catholics, for example, into the Liberal Party, or the attraction of Catholics to the Liberal Party because of that decision? Like, was that a really important moment in Australian politics where the Catholics who had tended to be supporters of the Labor Party for sort of cultural, traditional reasons switch sides to the Liberal Party on that one issue?
I think it would have been a huge effect in terms of average Catholics not involved in politics wanting to vote for the Liberal Party, or at the very least vote for the DLP in preference to the Liberal Party. I think I quote in my book, specifically Joan Ryden, who looks at it empirically, and she says that no, it didn't, right? Like it wasn't a case of Catholics not wanting to join the Liberal Party. It was just that the Liberal Party, upon its establishment, was primarily run by Protestants of a very vehement anti-Catholic ilk, members of Orange lodges, Freemason lodges, that sort of thing. Right? That's just a historical thing which may not appear today. And she says that as anti-Catholic, it was the fact that, like, in the 80s, anti-Catholicism broke down as opposed to people wanting to join that led a lot of Catholics to join the Liberal Party. I mean, if you go around, you ask any young Catholic that attends church, they are most likely conservative. If you go to, say, a traditional Latin Mass church, they are in no way voting for a left of centre party. Like, you'd be a very rare specimen indeed if that was you. And I think that's an interesting point because, Menzies was this sort of open, universalist, non-secular type of Protestant, and these sort of churches, I'm thinking the United Church, the whatever, are actually the representatives of left-wing thought, essentially. They're the religious wing of the leftist agenda today. Whereas the Catholic Church, of which was, I guess, in opposition to Menzies' government at the time, has, if anything, become a bulwark of Liberal Party supportership, although that's not borne out necessarily in the data, and I would argue that's because there's still many, many Australians ticking the box of I'm a Catholic or I'm this religion who don't attend church, and I think that muddies the water as well. Yeah,
there's sort of cultural Catholics and then religious Catholics, as you say, who are church attenders. It's interesting. I think you write, you quote Gerard Henderson, who's a journalist and runs the Sydney Institute, when he writes that Robert Menzies' attitude to Catholics had an air of noblesse oblige about it, for he made no attempt to open up the Liberal Party to Catholics, which I found quite interesting. So it is a sort of he's anti-sectarian, he announces state aid for non-government and Catholic schools, but in terms of welcoming Catholics into the Liberal Party as candidates, as politicians, as members, there wasn't quite that olive branch offered. Is that your understanding of the history?
Yeah, and that doesn't mean that Menzies was acting in bad faith or anything. It could have just been those were the battles he was willing to pitch on a wider political scale. But, within the party, interests are much more defined around individuals or smaller groups, or, Liberal Party says it doesn't have factions, but, well-defined friendship groups at the time or something. So that's how I see it. Like, if it was just up to Menzies, it might be a different story. But he did work within the environment of a political party.
Menzies retires as Prime Minister in 1966, and Harold Holt takes over the leadership and becomes Prime Minister for almost 2 years before his very untimely death. But Menzies really, in those post-prime ministerial years, while the Liberals were still in power, is said to have not voted Liberal sometimes, and he develops quite a close relationship with Santamaria and even starts donating to News Weekly to keep it going. So can you tell me about why he did that and how you interpret that relationship with Santamaria and support for News Weekly?
Yeah, so when I first stumbled on it, I was quite surprised, and at first I wasn't inclined to believe it, right? Because it's Santamaria writing after Menzies' death, saying that Menzies supported the party I founded. I had to check into that, but Menzies' daughter, in an interview, I believe I quoted, confirms that is also something that she heard. Why might this be the case? I think there's three reasons. One, anyone that has, in particular in Menzies' case, established a well-functioning or successful party or any organisation who then has to hand over the reins is going to be a little bit disappointed with who's running the show now, and that I think certainly was the case. It's also the case, I think, in Australian history is that you have these divides which are seen as so important at the time, particularly on the right side of politics, that, as I think the history of Australian politics is as the left becomes more and more, like, they're the ones expanding the Overton window.
Yeah.
That former foes find themselves on the centre-right of politics. And Santamaria would have had to have been described that way in his later life, that he represented policy opinions of the centre-right. And so I think it's just the history of Australian politics pushing former foes together. And, of course, they would have had to work together for many, many years, both from Victoria. I'm sure it's just a legacy of their involvement together whilst in politics itself.
Yeah. Oh, well, fascinating episode to uncover, Samuel, and what a great chapter. And thank you for your involvement in the Menzies Early Career Network.